Okay, so now that we've covered some of the fundamentals of Java, we're going to start getting into slightly more complex structures in our code. We're going to talk about decision structures. We could also describe this as conditional code. So essentially it's going to be something that will only execute based on some kind of decision that you're making. So based on some kind of condition that you're checking for somewhere in your program. So the first thing we're going to take a look at, the most basic decision structure, is going to be the if statement. So to make sure that we kind of understand everything that we've covered so far and what we're going to be getting into now, we've dealt with statements that are executed in sequence. These are going to be our sequential structures. So all of the code that you've seen so far has followed this sequential execution where the statements are executed from the top to the bottom, one after the other. So you go into the main method of your program. The very first line that you encounter in there, you're going to execute that, and then you're going to work from that down through the main method. So statements that are dependent on some circumstances or conditions are going to make up your decision structures. So these decision structures involve some form of conditional execution. Some statements will be executed while others are going to be completely ignored based on some kind of condition. So to start taking a look at the structure of this if statement, these conditions are going to be written as Boolean expressions. So we saw a little bit about that Boolean data type in chapter 2, where it's going to be anything that can evaluate to either true or false. So a Boolean variable, something that we're going to be using with these if statements. You could also describe this or refer to it as a flag. The simplest conditional code is going to be this if statement or if block. If some condition is true, we're going to go ahead and execute the statements that are contained in that block. So we can see our example right here. We're creating a Boolean variable, so we're going to go ahead and declare this variable called isRaining. It's going to have the data type Boolean, and we're going to assign the value true to it. We then have the actual if statement, so we have the word if. That's going to be a keyword in Java. So we're going to use if. We then have a pair of parentheses, and inside of that pair of parentheses, that's where we need to put our Boolean expression. So that's where something that evaluates to either true or false needs to be placed. So in this case, we're just going to put in a variable of type of Boolean. So we're going to use that Boolean isRaining. That's currently set to true. So because it's set to true, we're going to execute the statement that is inside of the curly braces just underneath our if statement. So that's going to essentially make up the block of code that we will conditionally execute. So you can see right here, if it is raining, we're going to go ahead and print out the statement, bring your umbrella. So let's go ahead and minimize this for a moment. We'll come over to NetBeans and we'll go ahead and start putting together some code for this. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project, be a new Java application. We'll click Next. For the project name on this one, I'm going to go ahead and call this one, let's start off with just conditional code. Go ahead and click Finish. So we'll go ahead and clean this up a little bit, remove some of the extra comments that we're not going to need. And adjust the style a little bit. And then right here inside of the main method, we'll go ahead and put together that little bit of code that we saw in the example. So we're going to say a Boolean. So we're going to specify the data type. We'll give it a name. We're going to say isRaining is the name of this variable. We'll use the assignment operator and assign the value true to it. We're then going to start putting together the if statement for this. So we're going to use the keyword if, and we'll have that pair of parentheses, and inside of here we're going to put in our Boolean expression. In this case, it'll just be the variable isRaining. We'll then have our pair of curly braces. So everything that we're going to put between these curly braces, that's what's going to be conditionally executed. So we're going to put in system.out.println. And right here we're going to say bring your umbrella. Go ahead and save that. And so now if we go ahead and run this, fairly simple program, we're just going to print out the phrase bring your umbrella to the console. So we'll run that, and we can see that statement printed out right there. And then of course we can also see what happens if this is false. So if I change this from true to false, so now if this is false, then we're going to go ahead and ignore what is between these curly braces. So we're not going to see this print statement now. So if we run this again, we see we still have that build successful printing out, but we don't see the print statement bring your umbrella anymore. So everything that we have between these two curly braces is going to be dependent on whether or not this condition here is true or false. So for now, we'll go ahead and leave this set to true, and we'll move to the next part. So there's some standard rules for style when you're dealing with your if statements. The conditionally executed statements should appear on the next line, so you want to kind of keep those separate. So you got your if, and then your condition, that's going to be on its own line, and then the conditionally executed statements, so everything that you put into the body, that's going to be on its another separate line. And you also want to make sure that these statements are indented, so that's very similar to the body of a class or a method. So you know how essentially every time that we've had a pair of curly braces, everything that you find inside of those curly braces is indented or tabbed over once. Another thing to take note of here, I'm showing it in this example, keep in mind that your if statement, so that if is raining, there's not going to be a semicolon on that line. Instead, you're only going to be putting the semicolons on the statements that you have inside of your block for your if statement. Another thing to note is that if you only have a single statement that needs to be conditionally executed, then the curly braces can actually be omitted. So unlike your class bodies or your main method, in this case, the curly braces, depending on how many lines of code you're dealing with, those curly braces are actually going to be optional. So we can actually go ahead and modify what we've written so far. So we can actually go ahead and remove these two curly braces. So it kind of shortens up the amount of code that we're going to deal with. So in some cases, you may want to compare two values as part of your Boolean expression. So you might want to be able to check to see the relationship between two values. There are going to be various comparison operators that you can use to compare two values. So these will include things like the greater than or less than. We also have greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, and we also have an equal and a not equal. So you'll notice with equal, because of the fact that a single equal sign already is used for the assignment operator, in order to get what we would describe as the equality operator, you have to use two equal signs for that. Additionally, when we're dealing with not equal, it's basically going to be this exclamation point. That's what we use to represent not, and then an equal sign. So we can see an example here where we are creating a double. So we're going to declare a double called sales. This is going to be equal to 30,000. And then we have our if statement, and inside of that we're doing a comparison. So we're going to say sales greater than 50,000. So if we read off the entire line, we're saying if the sales are greater than 50,000, then we will go ahead and execute whatever is inside the body of that if block. So everything between those curly braces. And in this case, what we're doing is maybe we have another variable, seems to be another double. We'll go ahead and set its value or assign the value 500 to that variable. So the code above compares the value of sales against the literal 50,000. If the sales are greater than 50,000, the variable bonus has the value 500 assigned to it. So we can go ahead and take another look at this right here. So let's say for this one, since we're dealing with something related to weather, let's go ahead and introduce another one right here. So we're going to have an int. Let's use a double for this actually. We'll call it temp, just be short for temperature. This is going to be equal to, let's say, 72 right now. We'll go ahead and include another if statement right here. So we're going to say if this temp that we have, if that is greater than, let's say, 90, we'll go ahead and print out another statement here. For this one, if it's greater than 90, we want to go ahead and just kind of indicate how hot it is today. So we'll just say it's awfully hot today. We'll go ahead and save that. And so right now, if I were to run this, right now I've got the temp set to 72. So if we check this comparison here, 72 greater than 90, well, that's going to be false. So because that's currently false, we're not going to see this printout to the console. So if I were to run this, we see only bring your umbrella. But then if I were to go ahead and change this, say maybe I do 92 instead of 72, well, now if we say if 92 greater than 90, that is going to be true. So now we're going to see this printout as well. So we'll see that here. So we can actually include multiple statements in our blocks, so in our if blocks. So we could have multiple statements that are conditionally executed based on whether or not our Boolean expression evaluates to true or false. It is important to note that if you have multiple statements for your if block, you must include the curly braces. So admittedly, while you can shorten your code by removing the curly braces when you only have a single line that needs to be conditionally executed, I would say that for right now, that is both a blessing and a curse, in that you might get into the habit of always leaving off the curly braces. I would say it's probably better to have a habit of just always using the curly braces until you become comfortable enough with this that you can more easily recall situations where you don't need them. Otherwise, you're going to run into situations where you accidentally forget the curly braces, and in this case, if you omit the curly braces, only the first statement after the if statement is going to be conditionally executed, but the remaining statements would always execute because they're not really considered to be part of your if block. They're considered to just be essentially part of the sequential structure of your program. So the code above is going to expand on the previous example, so what we saw on the previous slide, by introducing a commission rate and a days off variable. So we've got three statements that we will conditionally execute inside of the body of this if block. So three statements between those curly braces. So now if that condition is true, we'll go ahead and execute all three of those statements. Otherwise, if that condition is false, we're just going to ignore all three of those statements. So we can do something kind of similar over here. So let's say that in addition to checking this temperature and then saying it's awfully hot today, so let's say we go ahead and include one other statement right here. Let's say, depending on just how hot it gets, we might say you might need sunscreen. So go ahead and save that. And so now if I go ahead and run this, so right now we see that the temperature is set to 92, so this is still going to be true. If we run this, we see all three statements print to the console. But if I go ahead and change this back to 72, save this, so now this is going to be false again. Now it's going to ignore all of this. So we run this one more time, we see that. And then I suppose to go ahead and give you an example of precisely what happens if you forget the curly braces. So let's say we go ahead and just forget these. So kind of like this. So in this particular situation, what's going to happen is this statement right here, so line 14, that's going to be what's associated with this if block. So this is our conditionally executed line. This line, on the other hand, even though I've indented it to kind of make it seem as if it should be part of this if block, because I've left off the curly braces, this is going to be part of the sequential structure of this. So it's essentially part of just the main method itself, going from top to bottom. So if I were to run this now, this is no longer conditionally executed, it's always executed. So if we do this, even though this is false, we're still going to see that statement print to the console. And you'll even see this warning sometimes if you do this, where it's going to say something like confusing indentation, or it's trying to warn you that you've styled this program in such a way that it seems like you intended for it to do one thing, but it actually does another. So go ahead and make sure that we keep those curly braces in there so that everything executes based on the appropriate conditions. So in addition to being able to compare numeric values, so maybe like ints and doubles, we can also do comparisons with characters by using the Unicode values that are used to distinguish one character from another. So we know, based on the little bit that we've seen with the char data type, that each one of the characters has some numeric value associated with it, that Unicode value. So in this case, I've got this example, capital A has the value 65, capital B has the value 66. So if you were to do this comparison here, what you're essentially saying is if 65 is less than 66, so if capital A is less than capital B, then we'll go ahead and print out this statement, A is less than B. So we can actually go ahead and include this one as well. So go ahead and include that with the rest of this code, just so we can kind of see that. So we're going to do the character A, so make sure we have those single quotes around it. If this is less than the character B, we'll go ahead and do our print statement right here and say system.out.println A is less than B. And save that. And if we go ahead and run this, we can see that statement right here, A is less than B. So in addition to the if statement or the if block, we can also include another piece of conditional code. So there's an accompanying else statement or else block that we can use. So depending on whether or not a condition is true, we will either execute one block or the other. Essentially, the way that we would describe this is if the condition is true, we will execute the first block, so the if block, else we will execute the second block, the else block. So we can see again the example we had before. We have that Boolean is raining. Now we'll go ahead and set it to false. And when we do our if is raining, so we're checking to see if that condition is true, we would print out bring your umbrella. Otherwise, if it's false, we're going to go ahead and execute what we include in the else block. So we're going to say it's a nice sunny day. So we'll go ahead and add on to what we have already. So right here we've got if is raining, system.out.println, bring your umbrella, else system.out.println, it's a nice sunny day. And save that. And so if I were to run this right now, is raining is currently set to true. So if we take a look at that, we still see bring your umbrella. And now if I go ahead and change this to false, save that. Now it's going to go with the else statement instead. And so now it's going to say it's a nice sunny day. So it's a pretty useful way to be able to check a condition, and then regardless of whether it's true or false, we are guaranteed to execute some piece of code. It'll just kind of depend on what the condition evaluates to decide which particular line of code we're going to execute. One other thing to note about this is, just like with our if blocks, where you see we have these curly braces surrounding the statements that we will conditionally execute, the else block has the same thing. So maybe if you want to be as particular as possible about this, you could include all of these curly braces around the specific lines of code that you're going to conditionally execute. That way then you know precisely what corresponds to what. So now that we've seen a little bit with the if statement and the else statement, I'm going to go ahead and create another kind of practical example of a situation where we might need this conditional code. So we're going to do dividing by 0. So essentially what's going to happen is we might need some conditional execution when we're performing divisions. We want to check to see if the divisor, so in this case that's going to be num2, whether or not that value is 0. Otherwise, we might have some kind of error occur when we're trying to perform that division. So obviously, the problem that we might run into here is that we can't divide by 0. If we try to do that, you essentially get, some kind of nonsensical answer that's not really a number. So we're going to do a check right here. We're going to say if num2 is equal to 0. We're using that equals equals for the equality operator. We're going to do a print statement, cannot divide by 0. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and actually perform the division and then store that result that we get from that into the result variable. So minimize this. And so right here, we're going to go ahead and create another program to be able to do this. So I'm going to create another Java application. For this one, we'll go ahead and call this divide by 0. Click finish. Go ahead and clean up the code on this a little bit. And so right here, we'll go ahead and put in each one of our different variables and then set up our if and our else block. So we'll go ahead and do double num1. So we'll say this one is initially equal to something like 10. We'll have our double num2. Let's say this one's initially equal to 5. And then finally, we'll have our double for the results. And since this one's going to be modified later with the result of dividing 10 by 5, initially I'm just going to set this one to 0. We'll then go ahead and create our if statement. So we're going to say if num1 is equal, or num2 is equal to 0. Then we want to go ahead and include our print statement, say that we cannot divide by 0. So we'll be doing this little check right here first, and then if that's not true, so if num2 is not equal to 0, we can go ahead and include our else statement, and then we'll say result is equal to num1 divided by num2. So then if we were to run this, so right now, if we run this, because num2 is not equal to 0, so this is going to be false, we're going to go ahead and perform this division. We've not included any print statement to go with this, so we're not really expecting to see anything on the console. Go ahead and run that. So we successfully ran this, didn't see anything here, so that would seem to indicate to us that everything went as expected. So let's go ahead and change this to 0, and we'll try this again. And so now when we change num2 to 0, this condition is going to be true, so we're going to go ahead and print this statement out and say cannot divide by 0. So we'll execute that, and we'll go ahead and disregard trying to perform this division. So another thing that we can do with our if statements is we can actually put them inside of each other. So we can have an if statement within another if statement. In this case, the outer if statement is going to be checked first. So essentially, when you think about the outer one, technically with the order that you're going in from top to bottom, it's going to be the first one that you encounter in that order. The inner if statement is going to be checked second. So in this example here, we still have our is raining condition, so we still have that Boolean variable. We're going to introduce another Boolean variable called is thundering. And so in our check right here, we're saying if is raining, we're going to check that first. And then if that's true, we'll go ahead and start executing the code that's inside of it, so between those two curly braces. And inside of there, we're going to find another if statement, so another condition to check. And we're going to say if is thundering. If that's true, then we'll go ahead and execute what's inside of it, which is that single print statement that we have there. So in this case, it's going to say it might be best to stay inside, which seems reasonable. If it's raining and thundering, it's probably a thunderstorm. So let's go ahead and add this in. So we're going to come back over to our conditional code, and we'll go ahead and modify this a little bit more. So in addition to our is raining, we're going to include another variable here. So we're going to say Boolean is thundering. Say this is initially true. We'll go ahead and change this one back to being true as well. So we've got our if is raining, and then inside of here, let's say we leave the bring your umbrella. So we'll go ahead and include a combination of both a print statement and this nested if statement here. So say if is thundering, and I suppose to go ahead and make sure that this is very clear, I'm going to include a pair of curly braces specifically for this if block. And inside of here, we're going to say system.out.println. It might be best to stay inside. I'll go ahead and save that. So to make sure that we can kind of keep track of what's going to be executed depending on certain conditions, it's pretty useful to include these curly braces. So we can see we've got our if statement right here. We can then check the curly braces right here to see everything that's inside of it. So this is all of the code that will be conditionally executed if is raining is true. So then inside of here, I can kind of look through this code. We see another condition right here and this pair of curly braces that goes with it. So we're going to say if is thundering. If that's true, we're going to go ahead and execute all of the code that's between these curly braces. So that's going to be just this one line here with this print statement. So if we go ahead and run this, we've got both of these set to true. So we're expecting bring your umbrella and it might be best to stay inside. Both of those will print to the console. So we can see both of those right here. And then if I go ahead and change either one of these to be false, we can see what happens there. So let's start with is thundering. If that's set to false, then the expectation here is if is raining, that's still true. So we're still going to execute this line, bring your umbrella. But this condition is going to be false, so everything here is going to be ignored. So if we run this, we can see bring your umbrella, but we don't see it might be best to stay inside. So let's say we do the opposite. We make this true, but we make this false. So if we do this, so first we're going to check if is raining. That's going to be false. So because this is false, that means that all of this code is going to be ignored inside of it. So because all of this code is ignored, it doesn't really matter that is thundering is true because we're going to ignore that line anyways. So if we run this, we're actually not going to see anything other than the line for this else statement right here. It's a nice sunny day. So it doesn't matter what the value is for is thundering, whether that's true or false. At this point, it's irrelevant. In either one of those cases, we're just going to get it's a nice sunny day because of the fact that the outer condition ended up being false. So this inner condition is very much dependent on what the outer condition happens to be. Otherwise, we're just never even going to acknowledge it. So one last thing I want to take a look at is going to be the else statement. So we've got our else if statement. So we've got our if statement, we've got our else statement. There's also going to be the else if statement. So we can see a combination of these three statements right here. This is going to allow us to check multiple specific conditions. And then we also have a sort of fallback condition in that else statement if all of these conditions end up being false. So the way that this is going to work is we're going to check the first condition. So we're going to say if is raining. If that's true, we're going to go ahead and execute that line. And then we're going to just ignore all of the rest of the conditions that we specified here. If this first condition is false, so if is raining is false, we're going to go to the next one. So we're going to say else if is cloudy. If that's true, we'll go ahead and execute that one. So we'll print out it might rain later today. But if both is raining and is cloudy, if those two things are false, then we're going to have to go to the else statement, and we're just going to print out it's a nice sunny day. So this is very useful for specifying one particular condition that you need to be true out of a list of different conditions, and to only execute that the code that corresponds to that one condition. So let's go ahead and add another variable. This is cloudy, and we're going to go ahead and put that. We're going to go ahead and include that with our if and our else statement. So right here we've got is raining and is thundering. We're going to go ahead and make another boolean. Say is cloudy. This one, we'll go ahead and set this one to be true initially. So we still got both of these set to false. We'll make this one true. And then right here in between our if and our else, we're going to put in our else if. So right here, we need to go ahead and specify a condition. So it's just like an if statement. So we're going to say is cloudy. And right here, we'll go ahead and do system.out.println. I'm going to say it might rain later today. So I'll go ahead and save that. And so now if I were to run this, because is raining is false, we're going to ignore the code here. We're going to move to the next one, this else if. We'll check to see if is cloudy is true. That is going to be true. So we're going to go ahead and execute this. And because we're executing this, we're going to ignore the else statement. So we'll run that, and we'll see it might rain later today. If I go ahead and change it so that now this is false, and we go ahead and run this, then we're going to see it's a nice sunny day. So we're going to see the print statement for our else statement right there. And then the other thing to take note of is if is raining is true. So if you go ahead and set that to true, we run this, we're going to see just bring your umbrella. So you have just this statement printing. And one of the things to keep in mind about this is if you have something like if, else, if you make all of the conditions true, it is very important to keep in mind that when you do this and you run it, that only the first condition that's true is going to be executed. So even though is cloudy is true, because is raining was true and that came before it, it's just going to execute this and it's going to ignore this. So if you have a situation where you might have two things that are going to be true, but you want to make sure that both of those things could execute kind of independent of one another, then using the if, else if would not be a very good idea. Instead, what you would want to do is just have one if right here, and maybe do something like I had underneath it, where we have another if right here, and then another if right here. So all of those are able to execute independently of one another, which is kind of why you still see A is less than B every single time I run this. And of course, this would also be true for our temperature one as well. So I change this to 92. We save that. If I were to run this, then we can go ahead and see those two statements printing to the console as well. So those are going to be independent of anything that's going on with these conditions here. So at this point, this is going to wrap up everything for going through the if, the else, and the else if statements. Getting into the next video, I'm going to start talking a little bit about some of the different logical operators that we can use with our Boolean expressions.